nahi durjana sada kamarato kichu nahi moro guna
So I remember we were all very excited, and the customs doors were opening and closing, and I remember jumping up as the customs doors opened and closed to try to catch a glimpse of Srila Prabhupada. And I recall my first glimpse of Prabhupada was he was standing very patiently. He had his attaché case in one hand, he had his cane in another, and he had his chadar folded and over his shoulder. And he appeared to be very, very effulgent and very peaceful. And he appeared to be waiting for something. In fact, he was waiting for Bhagavan, who had been held up at immigration. In fact, immigration authorities told him that he could not enter the country because he did not have a visa. They had warned him in Singapore that he would not be able to come into Australia without a valid visa, but somehow they'd let him join the plane in Singapore. Now, Prabhupada was waiting for Bhagavan, and it appeared that Bhagavan, who is Prabhupada's secretary for the trip, or rather servant, it appeared that Bali Madan would not be able to be allowed into the country, Bhagavan. So Bhagavan, he explained to the immigration man that even though he did not have a visa, he was married to an Australian, because in fact Prabhupada had married him to Padmavati in the Cross Maidan Pandal program in Bombay in front of 30,000 people a few days or a few weeks before. He remembered this, and he told the immigration man that even though he didn't have a visa, he was married to an Australian. So the immigration man asked him for his marriage certificate. He told him that he didn't have one, but he did have a photograph of his wedding. So he showed the man the photograph of his wedding, and in the photograph was a picture of Prabhupada performing the wedding ceremony. And the immigration man had noticed when Prabhupada came through, and he was somehow or other moved by seeing Prabhupada. This was the main man in the office. The man at the desk had sent Bhagavan to speak to the head man. So the head man sent Bhagavan back with a stamp in his passport, indefinite stay. So he showed his passport to the man at the desk, who was incredulous, but nevertheless Bhagavan could understand this was Prabhupada's potency, and Bhagavan then was able to come through. So we were waiting for some time. Prabhupada entered the airport terminal. There was a huge kirtan, and it appeared that the whole airport stopped. And Prabhupada attracted a very, very large crowd. There were photographs taken, and it was quite amazing how many people were actually crowded around at the time. Everything appeared to come to a standstill. Of course, Churu had told all the ladies, when Prabhupada comes through, don't scream. And of course, when the Prabhupada came through, all the ladies screamed. And everybody paid their obeisances. They paid dandabats, full dandabats. In those days, you might have seen from our videos, the ladies used to pay their dandabats too. So everyone just paid dandabats wherever they were, and Prabhupada couldn't move because we were just crisscrossing the path. And a lot of devotees just stayed down there, and they didn't move. They didn't know, weren't sure how long they were supposed to stay down there. They just stayed. So some devotees had to tap them on the shoulder and say. So then we stood up, and there was a nice kirtan, and we were following Prabhupada through the airport terminus. Now, I don't recall the press conference, but there definitely was one. We were all fairly delirious. Churu recalls that when he paid his obeisances at Prabhupada's arrival, he banged his head on the floor so heavily that he had a mild concussion. And everything was very, very hazy. But we were all delirious in some way or other, spiritually or materially, and I don't remember the press conference, but in the newspaper there was a very nice description of the press conference where Prabhupada described how there were 4 orders of life: brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha and sannyas. The press reporter had written a very pukka article and had quoted all these Sanskrit names, spelling them properly, which was quite amazing. And Prabhupada described that he was in the 4th order of life, which meant now his business was to travel and preach. And Prabhupada's arrival was noted in the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian, and one Sydney daily newspaper. although at the time we were not familiar with accessing the newspapers. I don't know how many of us knew that those things were in the paper at the time, but looking through the archives, we found this information with some nice pictures of Prabhupada.
One question was by a reporter who asked, he asked Prabhupada, yours is a very ascetic movement, isn't it? And Prabhupada says, no. And then he said, but isn't yours more a self-denial type of lifestyle? And Prabhupada said, no, we teach love of God. And then the reporter said, but don't you think that, we've seen and we've heard that you're going to be taken away from here in a Rolls Royce? We'd previously hired a Rolls Royce with a chauffeur and everything like that. It wasn't a new Rolls Royce, kind of an old Rolls Royce, but it had the Rolls Royce label and everything, so it was quite significant to the press. And so Prabhupada said, well, we can use everything in Krishna's service. If someone offers me a Rolls Royce, why should I refuse it? He said that Guru is God's representative. Everything is meant to be used in God's service. So he said, Krishna, he rides in a gold chariot. And he said, what is this Rolls Royce? Some tin, some rubber, some wood? He said, I say it is not enough. All the devotees go, Jai Prabhupada. So I was thinking beforehand, this is, should we be doing this? Whose idea was this Rolls Royce? I was a little bit worried of what would people think about this, It's a little ostentatious, some vainglorious or something like that. But then, Prabhupada's answer was so bold that even the press, who are used to sort of being sharp and with a quick response and a quick reply to practically anyone, but there was just a silence. I mean, they were so shocked by Prabhupada's response that they just were flabbergasted. They just couldn't say any more. Jai Prabhupada, we paid our obeisances. Some silence, and Prabhupada said, Jai, chant Hare Krishna. And then Prabhupada got up and we had kirtan to the car. He went into the Rolls Royce and drove away. And
the very first time I saw Prabhupada was when I went down to the Domain in Sydney. For every Sunday the devotees would go and speak there. And on this particular weekend, the devotees said I had to come back to the temple because Prabhupada was speaking there. The spiritual master had come from America and from India. And so I went to the temple to see Srila Prabhupada, but he didn't give the lecture. He had Hanuman Swami give the lecture, which impressed me because I thought, well, I'd already read it, Easy Journey to Other Planets, which I got from a devotee on the street, and I was very impressed by that book, in as much as I realised that it wasn't about going to other planets at all. So I thought this guru knows how to attract different people and for a higher purpose. So I already had this idea, and so when I went to the temple and Prabhupada wasn't speaking, somehow or other it had the effect of making me think that the knowledge was absolute and he wasn't promoting himself as a personality cult, and that really impressed me. And after the lecture, I somehow drifted towards the temple and went in one side of the kitchen, and Srila Prabhupada got up from the Vyasasana, and he arrived at the opposite kitchen door at the same time as I came through the other door. And so Prabhupada stopped and looked at me, and I went like this. I thought he was, and I realised he was actually looking at me, not my body, just at me. And I thought he was looking at someone else, and so I sort of stared back at him, and he gave me this look, like a disgusted look, like, where have you been, sort of thing, And that Prabhupada's eyes riveting me had a very profound effect on me.
My husband Ajit, he was from Sweden, and he had written to Srila Prabhupada and asked if he could go and do some service there in his own country. So when Srila Prabhupada actually came to Sydney at Glebe, he called us in and said that he wanted us to go to Sweden, and he he asked about Sweden, what was it like there, and Ajit was telling Srila Prabhupada, and Ajit asked Srila Prabhupada, should we go out on Harinam? Or, Ajit wanted to preach in the universities, and he said, maybe they're not going to look upon us going out in dhotis and everything very well in Sweden, so what should we do, Srila Prabhupada? And Srila Prabhupada said, that's all right, you can wear suit. You don't have to do that. You wear suit and tie, and your wife can wear long dress, and you can go and preach like that. We also asked Srila Prabhupada if we could have deities, and Srila Prabhupada, because we were going to go to the first, I think it was Mayapur festival on the way to Sweden. We were going to go to India first, and then, we had planned to go overland to save money, but Srila Prabhupada told us, he said, no. He said, I realize you're very adventurous, young couple, but no, this is not very advisable, it's very dangerous, so you can save up a bit more money and fly. So we thought then we could go through India, and we asked Srila Prabhupada if we could buy deities, and we asked what kind of deities, and Srila Prabhupada said, yes, you can get Radha Krishna or Gauranitai. And we said, well, when we go to Sweden, what would be best? He said, either Radha Krishna or Gauranitai, but not to install immediately. So we bought Gauranitai deities when we were there.
He asked you that question.
Then Srila Prabhupada, for about 10 minutes, he just sat there and he just looked at both of us. Very, very, just very, very deep. He was thinking. And then he opened his eyes very wide and he looked at me and he said, who do you love more, Krishna or your husband? And I didn't know what to say because I realized I didn't love Krishna and I also didn't love my husband. So I just kind of burst into tears. And Srila Prabhupada then had a very, very big grin on his face. So I just couldn't understand Prabhupada's mind, what he was thinking. Anyway, then Srila Prabhupada said, if you go to Sweden and preach on behalf of if you go to Sweden on behalf of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, he will give you all of his blessings. So we got the blessings of Srila Prabhupada to go to Sweden.
I remember this incident in Melbourne in 1974. We always wanted to bring some gift to Prabhupada because it was such a nice thing to give something, or a flower or whatever. Devotees, when we were in Perth, Hansaduta Maharaj sent shoes, new shoes for Prabhupada all the way from Germany or something, and the reciprocation was Prabhupada sent him back his old shoes. I told the Sridhar. So devotees were always trying to think of something, give Prabhupada something. So I was in the temple room in St. Kilda one morning, and it's very crowded, and Prabhupada was arriving in his Vyasasana down that end. I was way up at this end. He couldn't see anything, but I heard Prabhupada say, don't touch the Bhagavatam to the floor. So I always pictured in my mind that his servant had maybe bowed down with his Bhagavatam in the hand and touched it to the floor. I was telling him, don't do that. So I thought, well, I had this idea to get a book cover made, and I asked one of the ladies who sewed for the deities to make this cover, and it had jari cloth and tassels and a pink lining from deity cloth remnants. And I thought that'd be a nice gift for Prabhupada. And I also bought some mangoes in town, some really nice peachy pink mangoes, which were out of season and hard to find. And I brought with those in a BTG box. I used to have these BTG boxes after the magazines were distributed. When Mataji had knitted a scarf for Prabhupada, a wool scarf, brown tassels. So when Prabhupada was in his room, he was speaking to pretty much a full room of devotees, serious subject matter. And I came in and I had this box, I sat down, I offered my obeisances, and I was just sitting and listening. And so there was a pause in the conversation, and Prabhupada looked at the box. He said, "So, what is this?" So the thing is, my mood was, I thought, I touched the microphone. The thing is, my mood was, I thought I had some good things for Prabhupada. I'd found some good gifts to give to Prabhupada. So I was, maybe you could say, puffed up. I was thinking, I got some pretty good things to offer here. So Prabhupada said, "So what is this?" And I got out the book cover, and I tried to say that I got in this book cover, it's to the cover of Prabhupada's Bhagavatam, because I heard him say that in the morning that you shouldn't touch it to the floor. And Prabhupada said, "I did not touch my Bhagavatam to the floor." Very serious. He would be very stern when he was serious. And then I tried to explain repeatedly. I tried to say, "But I meant," or "I mean," or "I meant to say." But every time I said, "I mean," or started to speak, Prabhupada spoke again before me. "I am not keeping my Bhagavatam on the floor." And then I said, "But I meant, I am keeping my Bhagavatam on the shelf or on the table." I'm trying to keep a serious face, but he was very serious. And all the devotees started laughing in the room. They were laughing and laughing. If you hear the tape, you hear them laughing really hard, particularly Charu. And I was like, I was totally embarrassed. I didn't know what to do. The Prabhupada wasn't going to let me explain it, so I just decided, I'm going to just sit here and take this, whatever happens. And Prabhupada said, "That is for you." So now I was like, I didn't think I had many nice gifts now. I was really embarrassed. And so then I pulled out the scarf and was hoping that when something came out of the box, I wasn't going to get something like that as a reaction. And gave him the scarf, and that's nice. And then I reached in and I pulled out the mangoes. And by now I was, you could say I was in a pretty humble state. I was not thinking, I was thinking, "Oh boy, what if Prabhupada's going to like any of these things?" And then I brought out the mangoes. And then Prabhupada's mood changed. He said, "Mango is the king of fruit. So this is a gift." And he smiled, "This is a gift." And then I put the mangoes on his table there. He asked Deepak, who was cooking for him, he said to put the mango in the milk that night, make mango milk. He said they can dry it and you can keep it and put it in milk. It's very nutritious.
One time I think there was myself and Pushta Krishna and Achyutananda in Mayapur, and we were talking about, consciousness and whether every living being is conscious or not. And Achyutananda was trying to argue that actually they're not. The soul may be there, but the consciousness is not displayed. And he said, if you start thinking that every living being is conscious, then you'll go crazy. Because then you'll think, well, all the atoms in the floor are conscious, so if I tread on the floor it'll hurt them, or if I close the door too hard, they'll all scream or something. So I was not really satisfied with, his reply to that. And so I went straight in to see Srila Prabhupada and I asked him about it. And then Prabhupada was able to immediately point out a verse in the first canto. And then he gave me this example of how You know, there's the skin and the nail. So if you cut the skin, then immediately you're hurt. But if you cut the nail, you can do that without any difficulty. So he gave that as an example of how there are different states coming from the same source, but there are different states, and therefore everything is actually, it's Krishna. Everything is Krishna, but Krishna's energies work in different ways. So matter, spirit is actually the same, it's from the same source, but according to how it's used. So that was one question I was able to get cleared up there.
In Bombay, I was cooking Prabhupada's, or cleaning after the breakfast, and I helped Diva Shakti. I made Prabhupada's breakfast, and then I was cleaning up, and that was, it was all, I was trying to do it really quietly, and then Prabhupada was going to take rest after that. For some reason, he was going to take rest, so I took a long time to clean up. I wanted to do it nicely, and then all of a sudden I noticed it was really quiet in his apartment. And it was so quiet, and I thought, gee, it's really quiet, and Prabhupada must be taking rest. So I went to go out of the apartment in Bombay. It was on the 3rd floor, and I was locked in, and I was just totally terrified that I was locked in with Prabhupada, who was a sannyasi, and the servant was gone, and I couldn't get out. And I thought, if Prabhupada wakes up and finds me here after he's taken his rest, I'll be in such big trouble. And I thought, I was like this panic thing, what am I going to do? Eventually I sort of went out onto the balcony and, was waiting for someone to walk by, and I see someone walk by. Help! Can you get someone to let me out? I didn't want to wake Prabhupada up, so I thought, this was the second time that had happened, because when I was in Sydney, I went to clean. They took me over to clean the apartment while Prabhupada went for his morning walk, and so lo and behold, Prabhupada came back untimely quickly. He came back to get something, then he was going back to the temple, so I think it was Bhagavan who came in and sort of, what are you doing here? I said, I'm just cleaning, He said, you can't be here, or something he was saying. I didn't know what was going on, and sort of shoveled me behind the door, and said, wait here, Prabhupada's not supposed to see you, he's going to get changed or something. I thought, so I'm standing behind the door like this, and I'm thinking, what do I do now, and I could see Prabhupada was taking his jumper off through the crack. I thought, oh no, I can see him getting chased. And I was thinking, they just left me here like this, And so anyway, all of a sudden the whole fanfare went out through the door and off, and I'm left behind the door, I'm thinking, will I come out? And they just left me there. And I thought, oh well, okay. So I thought, no, so it's just, I have this sort of lead of getting locked in Prabhupada's quarters and, not supposed to be there, and, it's just like the story of, it was hard for women in those days, because it was always like you were never supposed to be anywhere, but at the same time you're supposed to do all these things, And you were supposed to be invisible, but... So it's really funny. Actually, before, when I heard I had to speak this morning, I have to tell you this one. And Bigger said to me, it's us three, we've got to say something. And I said, oh, no, because this morning we were sort of lamenting, we're at the back of the temple again, and you go over and we're so liberated because we've all got one side for the women, one side for here, and here it's really right-wing in Melbourne. We're all down the back. And I said, well, they push us all down the back, and as soon as they need us for something, here we are up the front having to speak again, I thought it was just a really funny thing. And Rookie said, yes, you say that when you get up there. So for Rukmavati, I say that.
Prabhupada went to Scotland for the opening of the temple, and it was quite an interesting press conference. All these sort of, weary, hard-edged kind of journalists, cynical journalists mostly, had assembled from various Scottish newspapers, and Prabhupada had a connection with Scotland that most people weren't aware of at that time. That in fact he was educated by Scottish missionaries in Calcutta, the school he attended. So he knew a bit more about Scottish people in Scotland than we thought he might know. And I think the press people might have had an idea about that. So there was, I remember it quite well, because we were in his room. It was quite a small room, but there might have been 10 or 15 journalists there, along with maybe 8 or 10 of devotees. And they were asking these questions. They were sort of cynical kind of questions. Some of them are almost rude, like challenging. Why have you come here? What purpose are you doing? What do you hope to achieve? That kind of thing. And Prabhupada answered very, very, very nicely. He maintained his composure completely, and he gave, eloquent answers and quoted a bit from the Bhagavad Gita. And in a sense, they were becoming won over, as most people usually were. It didn't take very long. And one of the journalists, I'll never forget this, he became so either frustrated or didn't quite know what to ask Prabhupada in a kind of a offhand manner. He asked Prabhupada, he said, "So do you know everything?" Like that. And Prabhupada kind of took his time to answer, and he nodded his head and he said yes. But then he didn't just say yes like that, obviously, he purported it a bit, he added a little something to it. But that was a classical moment, where that question was asked of him, and he thought, and he answered directly and honestly, and he just said yes. And at that moment, there was like a feeling right throughout the room, amongst the devotees and amongst the journalists, that, perhaps it was true. I mean, and after that, the whole mood changed. They became very light-hearted.
We were walking back from that square near the British Museum, and there were only a few devotees there. There were only about 2 or 3 devotees with Prabhupada, and it had been on my mind for some reason or other. So I just said, "Does the Pope make spiritual advancement?" And he answered immediately and said, "Yes, because he's engaged in God's work." And we'd heard stories about the Pope doesn't follow the regulative principles or anything like this. So it was quite a surprise. But he was very definite about that he was engaged in God's work. And I thought about that for many, many years, actually. It's quite an interesting subject.
So, when I was in Australia, Srila Prabhupada was not very available to most of the devotees. But when I went to Bombay in the beginning of 1974, Prabhupada passed through many, many times. Whenever he was going around the world, he'd come through Bombay to see how the construction was going, and there were so many problems associated with Bombay. So the mood of Srila Prabhupada in Bombay, in India, was very different from when he was in Australia. Even his cloth, he would just wear the loose top and be very relaxed. And devotees could freely access Srila Prabhupada. And every night that Prabhupada was in Bombay, he would have a darshan on his roof. And Prabhupada would go up there, and sometimes he'd go up and there'd be nobody there, just a servant with Prabhupada or someone fanning Prabhupada, or sometimes he'd be sitting alone. And so he'd be chanting, so you could sit and chant with Prabhupada, and any questions you could ask. And then slowly, slowly guests would come, Indian guests and devotees, and it would become quite packed. So that was every day Prabhupada had, this more, there was more freedom with Srila Prabhupada there. And he had many film stars come, big industrialists, many people would come. And he was always so warm and welcoming, and they would come and sit right up the front. He'd bring them up the front, and then he would start preaching to them straight away. And I remember once there was this old man that used to come, and he just lived down the road on the way in between the temple and the beach. And he had some disease where he used to shake. His fingers, his hands and head used to shake all the time. So he used to come and he used to visit Srila Prabhupada, and he didn't do much, he would just go up to Prabhupada's room and sort of sit there and say a few pleasantries and sort of sit and shake there. He'd talk sometimes to Srila Prabhupada, but his servant, I don't know who he was at the time, stopped him coming because he thought, he's just wasting Prabhupada's time. And so the old man thought, I shouldn't go. He was really humble. And so he didn't go anymore to see Prabhupada. And then one day, after a long time, there were many devotees there, he came in and he offered obeisances. He was very old. And Prabhupada said, where have you been? Why haven't you been coming? And he said, Prabhupada, they told me not to come. And Prabhupada said, you can come at any time. And he chastised the servants, and said, let him come at any time. So I thought that was really wonderful of Srila Prabhupada, because his work was so important, his translating work, and there was no immediate benefit that you could see from this old gentleman coming in front of Prabhupada and sitting, taking his time, but Srila Prabhupada was so free, there with his time. Anybody who wanted could go see Prabhupada.
We were walking amongst the trees, and Srila Prabhupada commented, why don't they grow some fruit trees here? If they had fruit trees, then it would bring the birds. And that struck me as being pretty amazing. Who thinks of birds? But he was aware of so many different levels of what we understand to be reality. And then he asked, why do they have all these big buildings? Wouldn't it be nice if they weren't there, or something similar? But why do they have these big buildings? You could see from the gardens the skyline of these big tall buildings. And no one answered the question. So being an artist, there's that sort of attachment that whatever you create stays after you're gone. So I said to Srila Prabhupada in response to his question, well, I guess they want to leave something behind them, something that showed they were here. And he said, yes, this is exactly like the washerman's donkey, that he feels very proud to have all this washing on his back. The same principle. I can remember that to this day.
After Prabhupada went back to the temple, actually he didn't go there, we had a house for him this time, and it was a Grihastha couple, their house, and they'd moved out and let Prabhupada come into that house and let Prabhupada stay there during his visit. Now, it was, this house was kind of a modest house in a modest suburb, near the temple, not very far from the temple. And when Prabhupada arrived there, he came out and he walked in, and he walked through the house and walked through the rooms, and he says, "Oh, very nice house." He said, "How many families live here?" And Ugrashrava, who was the devotee who lived there, he said, "Oh, only one family, Prabhupada." He said, "Oh, only one family, such a big house." So, I mean, from Western standards, it was nothing, but for Prabhupada. So, once, just previously, he was saying that a Rolls Royce is not enough. I say Krishna has the golden chariot, and then when we just take him to a modest house, he's saying that, well, it's such a big house. How many families live here? And the next year, I remember that when we first opened our new temple here in Melbourne, that when we brought Prabhupada up the stairs, we just finished renovating everything. The devotees have been working hard for weeks and weeks, and months actually, and we brought Prabhupada upstairs and we showed him his quarters, which were quite well furnished, and parquet floor, and chandeliers, and low desk for Prabhupada's working, and we opened the door, and I think Madhavisa said, "Prabhupada, this is your room." And Prabhupada said, "What, all this for me? This is all mine." And then we took him next door to his bedroom, which was a separate room. And Prabhupada said, "Oh, I have a bedroom also." So, I just... Prabhupada's personality was, materialists generally, they portray a certain type of mood and attitude, and they generally live on that level. And you don't see very many other sides to them. But Prabhupada, and I didn't see that many sides to Prabhupada. I didn't have that much intimate contact with Prabhupada. But the sides I did see to Prabhupada showed that how it was inexplicable on the ordinary level, that in one sense, he's accepting a Rolls Royce, and another he's saying, "Oh, all this is for me." It's something that's a quandary, really. I mean, a materialist couldn't understand it, but we understood it because we were devotees. He was our spiritual master. We understood Prabhupada's transcendental position.
So at that time, Prabhupada got out of the car, and Upananda came out, running out of the temple, and paid his obeisances, and Prabhupada patted Upananda on the head very affectionately. And we were having a kirtan. Actually, I was getting out the car. There was a group of devotees having a kirtan on the sidewalk. The front door of the temple had blown closed, So Prabhupada reached to open the front door of the temple and it was locked from the inside. At that time, my mother and father had invited them. Apparently, there was some mix-up in the recollections, but I think before we went to the airport, there must have been some prior notification that Prabhupada was coming, but I think it was rather muddled. But I think at least we'd had the opportunity to invite some press to the temple. And somehow or other I'd also invited my parents to come. So when Prabhupada went to open the door, it was closed. My father was feeling very embarrassed about being seen with the Hare Krishnas on the street. And him and my mother were there only under duress. I'm surprised that they even came, but they came, and my father pulled open the little curtain and he saw Prabhupada trying to get in. So my father opened the door, and as Prabhupada went in the door, Prabhupada nodded at my father to say thank you. And then Prabhupada sat down on a very small Vyasasana, looked around the room at all the devotees present. At that time, there were a few guests. One of those guests was Bhakta Arthur. He's not here to recall this incident. But Bhakta Arthur recalls, Bhakta Arthur was a boxer for the South Sydney Leagues Club. And he was a pretty tough guy. And he was a carpet layer. And he had a carpet laying business. He was a pretty tough sort of guy. And Prabhupada looked around the room, and then his eyes stopped and looked at Arthur. So Arthur thought, well, I'm going to look back. So Arthur was looking at Prabhupada in the eye, and Prabhupada was looking at Bhakta Arthur. And Bhakta Arthur recalled that he was looking and looking and looking, and it got to the point Prabhupada's gaze was so intense that he had to eventually look away. But he recalls that gaze of Prabhupada, and it was a look of it was an affectionate but a very grave glance at the same time. And Bhakta Arthur, who later became Ajamil, he recalled how this glance, it seemed like this glance was what brought him closer to Krishna consciousness. Along with that glance came all the blessings of Srila Prabhupada and the disciplic succession. He felt impregnated with something very spiritual at that time.
Here in Melbourne, one time Prabhupada was walking through the park, and he stopped and he said, all sound is transcendental to a pure devotee. So we just pondered that and walked on. And I couldn't resist it. I just said, Srila Prabhupada, are you saying that these car horns, we can hear beep, beep, you can hear them in the back, beep, beep. Are you saying these car horns can be transcendental to a pure devotee? And Prabhupada said, yes.
There were a lot of times in Perth, particularly sometimes in Melbourne, I've even seen on film that I didn't remember asking Prabhupada about one case I was trying to understand the 8,400,000 species of life, and I asked Prabhupada, are those 8 million animal forms and human 400,000 human, are they on this planet, or are they divided by countries? Does it mean the Chinese, the Japanese, the Americans? Something like that. And Prabhupada said, no, you're thinking of this planet, but the Srimad Bhagavatam is speaking of the entire universe, the whole universe.
Prabhupada liked to walk out in the open, and especially here in Melbourne, and Melbourne and also Sydney. He liked to go to parks a lot, and we took him to the botanical gardens here in Melbourne, which are quite famous. He thought that actually he made a statement that the botanical garden in Melbourne is better than New York Central Park. So and he very much liked it. And I was quite amazed that when Prabhupada walked through the park, he knew a lot of things that would seem a person in his position perhaps wouldn't bother even speaking about, like what the names of the trees were. And Prabhupada would walk, and he'd say, "This is a such and such tree," and then he said, "Go and have a look." Because in the park, all the trees had little kind of name tags. So he'd send someone over, and then the devotee would come over, and he quite thought it was in Latin. They'd have the Latin name there, and he said, "What is that?" And he said, "Such and such in Latin." And he said, "But what in English?" And he said, "Yes, just see." So we would walk along like that. And that kind of surprised me. Oh, Prabhupada, he knows all these things. He knew about trees, he knew about flowers. You know, he very much appreciated the beauty of the park. Also, I remember another time when we were walking, we were walking, it was early in the morning, I guess it was about 6 o'clock, and Prabhupada saw that Prabhupada saw that even at 6 o'clock there was heavy traffic going into the city, because these gardens were really close to the city. There was heavy traffic going into the city. And Prabhupada said, what is this traffic? And someone said, oh, they're all going to work, Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, he stopped and he was silent, and he just said, they are working so hard. And I could see his eye was a little moist, you know, just the stage before a tear would come. He felt, you could feel that he felt so much compassion for these people that he was concerned that they were, even early in the morning at 6 o'clock, they were racing and rushing into work. He said they are working so hard. And then another time, I think it was that same morning, he saw that some of the businessmen were driving their cars and then parking them right out at the Botanical Gardens, which was about 3 or 4 kilometres from the city. So he was asking, what are they doing? And someone explained that, Prabhupada, they park their cars here so that they can avoid paying parking fees in the city. And Prabhupada said, just see. He said, then he gave a story, he said, a man can ride in a big carriage, but he can't afford to feed the horses. So everyone laughed. And it was so poignant at that point that here we have, you know, someone driving a big car, big businessman wearing a suit and tie and a briefcase and everything, and then they park the car outside and have to walk 3 or 4 kilometres into the city to go to the office.
And when we cleaned his quarters, we would always change his sheets, and Prabhupada stopped that. He said, you don't change them every day, you just change when they're dirty. And of course they were never dirty, but you know, Prabhupada wanted that. And another thing, he used to have a garland, his fresh garland. He had a picture of Radha and Krishna on his little table. And after he'd come back from his morning class and everything, he'd take off that garland and put it on a picture of Radha and Krishna on his desk. But we weren't allowed to throw it out. And on the wall there was the disciplic succession, Bhaktisiddhanta, Gaurakishore and Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So after the garland had been on the deity picture, we would take it off so that he could put the fresh one on, and then we'd place it on Bhaktisiddhanta's picture, and then the next day we'd move it down to Gaurakishore's picture. We'd be moving them all along, and then down to Bhaktivinoda Thakur's picture, and finally we could take it as prasadam. So Prabhupada was very particular about things like that. So one day I had this Bhaktivinoda Thakur's garland on, which you can imagine in the Bombay sun was quite shriveled, you know. So that day I started to think, oh gee, Prabhupada doesn't really know me, and he knows so many devotees so well, and you know, he hardly knows me, and I was feeling, you know, a little bad that I don't get to do very much for Srila Prabhupada, and I was making his vases, which I did every day, and I used to take them up at 11 o'clock. At that time Prabhupada was always having his massage. So that day, the very day I'd been thinking that, I went upstairs and Prabhupada was in his room. So I stopped in fear, in awe, you know, and then I walked in, I put the vases down and offered obeisances, and I was flustered and I was trying to back out of the room. And Prabhupada, he looked at that old garland and he said, where from you got this garland? And he said, here, you take this one. And he reached down and he took the fresh garland from that morning that he just put over the picture of the deities, and he gave it to me. Oh, so I felt so happy, and I realised that Prabhupada, he knows what we need. He knows exactly what we need in spiritual life, and it was just so much encouragement from Srila Prabhupada. Then I felt also foolish that I'd had to think like that, and that Prabhupada had to cater to me. But still, it was very treasured for me, you know, that had happened.
For Prabhupada's second visit to Melbourne, for Prabhupada's second visit to Australia, Prabhupada was coming to Melbourne for the first time, and when Prabhupada arrived at the temple, I do recall Krishna Premi was crying, and she was trying to sing. She was trying to sing Vande Hum, Sri Guru, on harmonium, and crying at the same time, and it was quite an intense affair. But it was done with great affection and sincerity, and Prabhupada nodded and smiled at Krishna Premi. And I remember Upananda had made a big plate of Simply Wonderfuls, which was the #1 delicacy in those days. Somehow or other, Simply Wonderfuls were like the summum bonum of life. Some devotees made their own Simply Wonderfuls on the side. Ajamil was famous. He got Gaurangi, Raghunath's wife, to make him an extra large bead bag, and we weren't sure the reason behind it until one day I discovered that inside Ajamil's bead bag, along with his beads, was a small packet of sunshine powdered milk, a packet of butter, and a packet of icing sugar. So Ajamil sometimes used to sneak out the back and roll his own. So we were very addicted to Simply Wonderfuls, and Upananda had made these Simply Wonderfuls. He offered a plate to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada, I don't think he took any, but he nodded, and then he made a gesture to distribute the Simply Wonderfuls to everyone. I was very much into rules and regulations. I was very pedantic in those days, and probably the best man for being the temple commander, although I must have offended probably every devotee in Australia. But all I could think of was at the time when the Simply Wonderfuls were coming around, I was thinking, but we just read in the Nectar of Devotion a couple of days ago that we shouldn't eat in front of the deity. So I was thinking maybe this is an offence. But I saw everyone else eat their Simply Wonderfuls, and I was very perplexed. I was thinking perhaps we're all committing a great offence here. But in fact, of course, taking prasadam from Srila Prabhupada is beyond any rules and regulations.
I remember one thing that he said really affected me. He asked Upendra, are you studying my books? And Upendra said, yes, Prabhupada, I read your books every day. And Prabhupada thumped the desk. You read my books, but I said, do you study my books? And Prabhupada was emphatic. He said, you must know the meaning of every word. If you learn a verse, don't just learn the verse, like you must know the meaning of every word. He was very emphatic, like study. The difference between studying and reading. So I took a little bit to heart at the time.
I know Prabhupada wasn't very keen on our men making movies. You know, there was a discussion that Gyanagamya had with him in Iran in August of '76, and he was very keen on that at that time of making a big commercial, full-scale movie. You know, the millions of dollars thing. And he had this idea that somehow or another it would popularize the movement. His idea was to show some scenario where the devotees were involved and people could see how we lived and get an appreciation from that. Prabhupada dismissed it. Gyanagamya brought up 5 or 6 different angles. He was desperately trying to get a yes from Prabhupada, but Prabhupada would not give him an endorsement for it at all. And he said, for the kind of money that you're spending, this was one of the arguments that he used. He said, the kind of money that you would spend on that, he said, how many books could you distribute? He said, and I have personal experience anyway, expending so much money and getting practically no result. He said, when I first went to New York, he said, then I put an ad classified in the New York Times. So he said, at that time it cost me so much money, I had practically nothing. For one small ad, it ran for 1 or 2 days or something. He said, I got 3 responses, and none of them bought my books. So he said, I have personal experience. This is, a waste of time. Well, I mean, as far as movies go as well, because in India, you can make movies about Krishna. And they've done it very often. But, they always want to focus in on Krishna's 10th canto, Gopi Leelas and things like this. So I remember when we were in Bhubaneswar, this was in late January and very early February of '77. So this movie maker came, 2 or 3 of them came, and they explained to Srila Prabhupada that we're making a movie, we want to popularize Krishna's pastimes. Now Hare Krishna is becoming very popular, and we want that everybody should know about Krishna, and we want to show Krishna's Vrindavan pastimes. And so, we'd like, you are the guru of the Hare Krishna movement, so we would like to get your blessings for making this movie, and we'd also like to just put a little mention of our humble thanks, for the work that you've done in popularizing Krishna's pastimes on the movie. So Prabhupada immediately, told them no. He said, why do you want to immediately jump to Krishna's 10th canto pastimes? So they were saying, but Swamiji, everybody in India is a Krishna Bhakta. And Prabhupada told him, he said, nobody will understand. You'll show them and they'll take it as some mythology. Krishna killing the Trinavata whirlwind or whatever. He said, then they'll all think it's simply mythology. So then they said, oh, but Swamiji, everybody in India, they're all Krishna Bhaktas. So the evening before, Prabhupada had a conversation with a man who had asked him, actually, who is Krishna? Prabhupada was shocked. He's an Indian man, supposed to be educated, asking who is Krishna, and he chastised him like anything. It was in a darshan. And Prabhupada said, you're born in India, you do not know who is Krishna? And then when he had given his evening lecture, he brought it up in the lecture also, that, here we are in Punya Bhumi, in Bharata Bhumi, and now people are so degraded that they're asking who is Krishna. So now this film man came a day or 2 later, and he said, oh, but Swamiji, everybody's a Krishna Bhakta. Prabhupada said, you say that they're Krishna Bhaktas, but he is asking who is Krishna. So he said, why don't you make a movie of the 1st canto? You show that first, and then progress. You go progressively through the Bhagavatam, and then you can do the 10th canto. But of course, they wanted the 10th canto, Krishna with the gopis and this and that. But Prabhupada would not give them an endorsement, because they were simply trying to, capitalize on Prabhupada's popularity. Oh, this movie is approved by Bhaktivedanta Swami. But Prabhupada would not give him an approval. And after about half an hour, again, they brought up various arguments. Prabhupada would not budge an inch on it. He refused. He said, if you make one of the 1st canto, then we'll see.
At different times we were playing the materialist in the morning walks, and then some time would pass. So at one point, Ganesh Prabhu, he posed a question, but it wasn't in a context where one could see that this was posing as materialist. But he was just asked, he said, Srila Prabhupada, if the Bhagavad Gita is 5,000 years old, and Prabhupada said, what? Bhagavad Gita is not 5,000 years old. Have you read Bhagavad Gita? He says, yes, a little. Then you should know. You're a student of Bhagavad Gita, and you think it was written 5,000 years ago? And he started to walk. He said, millions of years. Bhagavad Gita, he began to explain. They stopped and said, you should know. He was getting really heavily chastised. But then I said, maybe he was posing as a materialist, Prabhupada. Prabhupada said, yeah, even so, one should know Bhagavad Gita was not written 5,000 years ago.
Now, another time I remember going for a morning walk was where Prabhupada, we were walking, and actually Prabhupada used to walk, and he would exchange greetings even with karmis. Someone would walk and someone would say hello, and sometimes he would just say hello, or he would say good morning. Well, other times he would say Hare Krishna. One time I remember a group of joggers jogged through. It was about half a dozen, maybe they were some club, part of some club or something. They were jogging through, and after they jogged through, making very loud kind of sound, stomping with their sand shoes and breathing heavily. And Prabhupada stopped and he turned around to all of us and he said, they are thinking by this exercise they are increasing their life. But they do not know that with every breath, one only has a certain number of breaths in the life. Because they're exercising very hard and breathing more rapidly, actually they're decreasing their life. So they are thinking with exercise they are increasing, but actually they are decreasing. So these are some of the things that I remember from Prabhupada walking. Another time when we were, just before we got this present temple we're in now, we took a Prabhupada for a morning walk along the beachfront, which is just near here. And we were showing Prabhupada premises we'd been living before that time in a really small temple, just 4 or 5 kilometres from here, and it was so small that, hardly anyone could fit in there. So we were looking to buy another place, and so we were showing Prabhupada this place we were thinking about, and it was this huge kind of monastery or something. Some nuns were using it. I forget the name of the particular order. But and it was this huge property, like right on the beachfront road, which is one of the main arteries into the city, and had a big, huge wall on the boundary, and you could see over the wall and the convent and the chapel and all the other buildings. It had a large number of buildings on the property itself. So at that time, I think they wanted like over $1 million, which back then was a lot of money. I mean, it must have been at least 10 million these days. So, I'm thinking, someone had the idea, or a few devotees had the idea, maybe perhaps, we should try to get this property. And I'm thinking, we'll never be able to afford this. They want over $1 million anyway. Somehow or other, we were showing Prabhupada. So we were going on the morning walk, and I think Madhavisa and someone else, they were talking about the Prabhupada was asking questions, and Witten and Madhavisa said, we're thinking of buying this property, Prabhupada. Prabhupada said, and he stopped. He was silent. Then he started walking again, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna. Then he started asking, so what is their asking price? Everyone stopped. They want over $1 million. I thought that when Prabhupada heard that, he would say, no possibility of getting this property, but he was very serious. And he kept asking different questions as we were walking. So I could see from that, I learned from that nothing was outside of the scope of Prabhupada's plan. And we didn't know how, we didn't have any money, not that type of money anyway, but Prabhupada was serious. And later on he asked to see the inside grounds and walk through the buildings. So that was arranged, and he was walking through. Later on, after that visit, we learnt that this particular order would only sell us the property if we would demolish the chapel. They didn't want us to use the chapel. So Prabhupada said, let them demolish it. We won't demolish the chapel. How is this? He said, if they want to demolish it, just see. He said, they can demolish, but we'll never demolish. Later on, because they refused to sell us that property except for that condition, we informed Prabhupada this was after he'd left, we informed Prabhupada that it was not possible really to get that property. So later we were looking at this property we're in now, and we told Prabhupada that it was smaller. And then Prabhupada says, well, sometimes smaller is better. So he came and opened this temple here, and he was very pleased by that.
When Prabhupada first came to New Zealand, we met him at the airport, and he came into his room, and he was seated behind his desk, and I sort of sat before him pretty much like this, where I was just seated in front of Srila Prabhupada, and some sannyasis were over in the other corner. And I just straight away, because we've been preparing for so long, for making a new altar, carving Jagannath deities, getting Gaur Nitai. I brought Gaur Nitai personally back from India at great difficulty because they were a great big deity, brass deity, I had to carry them. And so we were looking forward to this. And I said, Srila Prabhupada, we can install Gaur Nitai deities and Jagannath deities. And Prabhupada sort of sat there, looking at me. And after a while, he sort of didn't look at me, he wouldn't look at me, but he looked over at the sannyasis and he said, dolls. Just dolls. He is thinking they are simply dolls, idols, that's all. And so I was sort of a little bit shocked because I wasn't actually thinking like that. So then Prabhupada said, why do you want to install? And I said, well, it is Lord Chaitanya's movement. I think we should worship Gauni Tai. And our Jagannath Deity, Srila Prabhupada, is 6 inches tall. If we have Rath Yatra, who will see them? And so Prabhupada went, just like that. So the next morning, we went down to greet the deities, and we opened the curtains, and Prabhupada saw that I actually built an altar. He must have just thought, well, this guy's really spaced out, you know, like that. And Prabhupada turned around to me and he said, oh, so you've made preparation. So this is not just some idea. So you've made some preparation. Oh, yes, we will install Guru Gauranga and Jagannath, Balaram and Subhadra. So, but all that night I was very tossing and turning, wondering what to do. So when we actually installed the deities, as soon as the curtains opened, Prabhupada said to the Pujari, shut the curtains. So I went up to Prabhupada and I said, well, what's wrong? He said, Gauni Tai have no crowns. So I went back into the deity room, and I didn't know what to do because Gauni Tai we just hadn't got crowns together for Gauni Tai. So I managed to find a couple of bangles like this from Radha and Krishna, and I put some blue tack and a brooch on the bangle and put it on Gauni Tai's head like that, and then just opened the curtains. So then Srila Prabhupada was sort of standing there, and I sort of went up and sort of said, is that all right? And Guru Kripa went bang, punched me in the chest really hard, really hard. And just as I was choking for breath, Srila Prabhupada leaned over and said, and now you must have Rath Yatra. So every one of those words stays in my mind.
One young girl, Brahmacharini, put up her hand, and everyone, in the room looked. Oh yes, someone's going to ask a question. And I don't think it was even relevant to the class at the time. And she said, Srila Prabhupada, does Krishna speak the Bhagavad Gita in the hellish planets? So Prabhupada, he thought for a moment, and he looked back and he said, hellish planets? Hellish planets? You don't think this London is a hellish planet? And so, everybody thought that was quite funny. I mean, it was quite funny. It was an excellent way of answering the question, because it answered the question, but also enlightened us to think that, what is our position? Yeah, so that's one question that sticks in my mind. Of course, another time we refer to England as a green hell, which is quite, it's a wonderful use of the English language, to describe Britain or England in that way, which is quite an apt way to describe it.
One of the morning walks in Perth that I remember the most was in a particular park. I forget the name now. And I probably won't be able to remember all the conversation. You can see it in the conversation transcriptions. But I asked Prabhupada, because when we're preaching, sometimes people say, you say that Krishna consciousness is a science, but we think it's a belief. Why do you call it a science? And Prabhupada said, if you can call your science, if you can call your beliefs science, then we can call our beliefs science. Because what you're calling science is really just belief. For example, you believe that the living entity comes from matter, from chemicals. But where's the evidence? Where's the example of a living entity coming from matter, from chemicals? So it's simply a belief, and you're calling it science. So if you call your belief science, then we can call our belief science. But it went on. It was a very interesting conversation.
I asked Prabhupada a couple of instructions. Oh, actually, Prabhupada told me I used to dress Radha Rasa Bihari, And I had put a red Ramanuja type tilak thing inside Krishna's tilak. And Prabhupada sent a message, you never to put anything in Krishna's tilak like that. Krishna's tilak should always be clear. And then another time I asked him about spices because he'd restricted spicing. And I asked him, well, can't we even use mustard seeds? He said, look, it's just cumin seed and hing. It's sufficient actually for the deities. And he also, I asked him about Radharani's hair because there was some contention at the time in Bombay that Radharani's hair shouldn't be showing. It shouldn't be out. It should be tied back because she's the most chaste lady. But we often used to put her hair out. And so I asked Srila Prabhupada, can Radharani's hair be out or does it have to be tied back? And he said, whatever you think looks nice. So he wasn't strict on that.
I was recommended for second initiation, and we were asked to go out and collect dakshine. Now, in those days, generally speaking, maybe there were some exceptions. We didn't usually come up with very much money. We used to go, I remember going along Burnett Street, knocking on the door of terraced houses and apartments and telling people that tomorrow I'm going to be initiated by a bona fide spiritual master. I wondered if you could please give me some donation as an offering. So I came back with about 55 cents. I put it on a saucer and I brought it in with me. I remember Jagatarini also recalls collecting not much more than that. And somehow or other I thought that it wasn't a bad collection. But anyway, I tried pretty hard. Prabhupada, when I came in the room, Prabhupada was lying on a chaise longue. Prabhupada often would like to recline in the afternoons on chaise longue, the long seats with a scrolled end like we have in Prabhupada's room. The Brahmachari room in the Burnett Street temple had been transformed into Prabhupada's room. I remember Dormia Prabhu, his parents had gone overseas, so he had raided the house and taken all the furniture out of the house. And we'd filled up Prabhupada's room with all this nice furniture, including the chaise longue. So Prabhupada didn't have a shirt on, and he had his dhoti. And of course Prabhupada had very soft golden skin, which appeared to be, glowing and effulgent. We had a little chandelier on the ceiling. As we went in the door, Prabhupada was lying, the chaise longue was on the right-hand side, his desk was on the left-hand side of the room, with his back towards the window leading onto the little veranda which overlooked the street. So Prabhupada was lying, reclining on the chaise longue, I think, on his left arm. And Prabhupada asked me to sit down in front of him, and he showed me how to count on his fingers, how I should be counting on my fingers for the chanting of the Gayatri mantra. I was very sure of myself at that point. I'd been watching Upananda saying his Gayatri mantra in the mornings, and I'd figured out how to count, or at least I thought I did. And I thought that the counting started from the top of the index finger. So I think when Prabhupada was showing me how to count, I wasn't watching very carefully. I was thinking, well, actually I already know how to do this. I'll get it first time. So after Prabhupada showed me the counting, I attempted to count starting from my first tip of my first index finger, and Prabhupada shook his hand and said, no, and he showed me again. I started to get to panic at this point, as was a common experience with many devotees when they're in the room alone with Prabhupada. I'd never been in the room alone with Prabhupada, and I was perspiring and shaking. My eyes didn't seem to be working anymore, and I couldn't focus. And all of a sudden, it just felt like all my limbs had locked up, and everything just went blank. And Prabhupada showed me again, and even though he was moving his fingers, everything was just hazy. And I tried again, and I got it wrong. And then I tried again. Prabhupada was getting very angry, and I got it wrong again. So then Prabhupada, he held my thumb down on my finger and said, you have to start from here. And he looked very disgusted, and I felt microscopic. And he placed the sacred thread over my shoulder, and then I left the room.
The devotees were trying to bring some important people to meet Prabhupada because he'd requested that. So, like some ministers of government, heads of departments, ministers of religion, and even I think a bishop came. and someone from the Catholic Church, a high official from the Catholic Church. So Prabhupada was sitting and preaching to all these people. And then someone brought in a gentleman, and he came into the room. I don't know, someone announced he's such and such, and gave his title. And he sat down, and Prabhupada looked up. He was behind his desk. And he said, "You have any questions?" So this man, I was looking at him, and this man, he's just sitting there, and he was wide-eyed, like that. He looked a little unstable, actually, to me. He looked wide. He didn't say anything. He was just silent. And Prabhupada just began preaching to him. He didn't wait for any reply. I mean, the man was silent. He didn't say anything. So he probably just started preaching, about not the body, very kind of basic, or part and parcel of God. Name of God is Krishna. And he went on and on and on and on. Long time. And the gentleman was just sitting there, didn't say anything. And then at the end, he had that man had that same expression. His face is wide-eyed, just looking at Prabhupada like this. And then Prabhupada stopped and he said, "So, give him some prasadam." So some devotee gave him had some fruit or something on a plate. They thanked him for coming. He still didn't say anything. The whole time he didn't say anything. And then they let him outside. Then after he left, Prabhupada turned to the devotees and said, "That man was ghostly possessed." And I've been thinking there's something strange with him, but Prabhupada immediately, he knew. But still, the wonder of it was that he just preached to him. He wasn't phased, his condition or anything. I mean, he'd been brought in as a guest, and Prabhupada treated him as a guest, no matter what his condition was, and I could see that. And then all other, Prabhupada talked to many different types of people, and all of them he treated them as guests very cordially, very respectfully. Of course, one time there was a professor was invited, and he began to challenge, and especially challenge the philosophy of Krishna consciousness, and challenge the devotees. And I think Guru Kripa was there at the time, standing next to Prabhupada, and he protested. He said, "Look, you're coming, and now we brought you to meet our spiritual master, and now you're starting to insult him." And Prabhupada wasn't saying anything at this point. And just trying to think what the exchange there was quite dramatic. That he said, that the professor said something to the effect that you people pose yourself as knowing everything, and then he was talking to Guru Kripa, and when he was talking to Guru Kripa, and he started to take an insulting kind of mood to Guru Kripa, then Prabhupada responded back. He said, "We are posing as knowing everything, or you are posing as knowing everything? We are narrow, or you are narrow?" So then the moment was very tense. There was a kind of a silence. But then, just as that moment came, Prabhupada just changed the whole mood around. I said, "Anyway," and then he started speaking very respectfully to him. And then by the end of the discussion, this man went away, very grateful that he came. Although in the beginning, obviously, he'd come to sort of challenge, and he was a bit agitated by the devotees, and I think that was his mood when he initially came, to actually challenge Prabhupada. But Prabhupada was so expert that he just changed his whole mood around. He defeated his challenge, and simultaneously, this man went away respectful to Prabhupada. Incredible.
One day, Ganesh Prabhu, who was in Perth also, he brought his mother and his sister to meet Prabhupada. And his mother's Hebrew, and she was feeling defensive. that this is a confrontation. You're saying your religion is the truth, so that means you're saying mine's not the truth. And Prabhupada was reassuring her by saying, it doesn't matter whether one's Hebrew or Christian or Hindu or Jew. If one knows God and loves God, then that is the truth or the proper path. But still she was saying defensive things. And again he said, it doesn't matter, Hebrew, Hindu, Christian, Jew. If you know God and you love God, then that is the truth, that is the path, or something like that. So then she became at ease, and she was comfortable. She didn't feel challenged. She let her defenses down. And then Prabhupada, he had this certain mood. When he was in a certain mood, his eyes would be very soft, and he was very humble, and he said, so, can you tell me who God is? And then she turned all red, and she looked down, and it's like, oh, couldn't say anything about that. And then her daughter, Ganesha's sister, said, God is love, or something like that. But then she realized that she was defensive, and Prabhupada sort of disarmed her defense, and then he just very humbly asked if she knew who God was. Because that was the point. If you know God, if you love God, then that's the truth. So do you know God? She didn't know anything. And then Prabhupada began to explain that Krishna, who Krishna is, that he's Bhagavan, that he has unlimited beauty, unlimited wealth, unlimited strength, unlimited fame, unlimited renunciation. Advaitam achutam alhadi malantarupam. He's the original person, and from him unlimited other forms of himself arise, and that he is eternally young, although he's the oldest. Adyan Purana Purusham Navayovanam Cha. He is the oldest of all. He's the original person, but he's eternally young. He never grows old. So then he was just telling her who God is. That was very nice to see the way Prabhupada dealt with her feelings, and then just told her who Krishna was in such a way that she could listen.
I particularly remember that he mentioned on one show, there was some kind of Christian minister that was going around and really heavily criticizing us, and he was being invited to different talk shows. So he was criticizing us how we worship this man, you know, this mythological man who had sex with 16,000 wives, and you know, he was trying to make out that actually the whole basis of our movement is immorality. It's a typical kind of thing that people think that Krishna is an ordinary man and that he's immoral. And so Prabhupada then very nicely, very strongly, but very expertly explained how sex desire is there originally in the spiritual world. And for Krishna, sex is not bad. He's God. He enjoys everything. So why only 16,000? You know, he can enjoy 16 million. And for him it is not bad. But he said, for you, it is bad. He said, you cannot have sex. You know, and, you know, attacking. This was Prabhupada's method. He would cut them down and give, you know, real philosophical reasons, but really punch them home as well. He was very strong. So he explained there that how, you know, the Adi ras, that's the original form of sex desire, the original rases that Krishna has in the spiritual world. But in the material world, when they imitate Krishna, then it becomes the most degraded. So for Krishna, what is the most highest activity, when it's reflected pervertedly in the material world, it becomes the very lowest and the most degraded. And you know, so that was one point anyway that he explained there.
Prabhupada, someone said the Namhat know the whole fifth chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. So Prabhupada says, so he wanted to impress these life members. And suddenly the whole Namhat turned around and it was just me. I was the end of the room. So I go, Yoga Yukto Vishuddhatma Vijitatma Jitendriya Sarvabhutatma Bhutatma Kurvanapina Lipite. It was the first sloka out of the fifth chapter I could think of. And it sounded so lilting and sort of, the tune sounded so bad. And but the life member, to sort of ease the embarrassment, said, very nice melody. And Prabhupada said, yes, very nice melody, thank you very much, sit down. But I was supposed to chant the whole fifth chapter, the whole Namhat was, and we didn't do it. Prabhupada was very merciful, very tolerant.
And one other time it was Govardhan Puja, and Vishalini came. And she learnt all the lines for Krishna, and she dressed herself up in a dhoti, and she put blue, and she learnt the lines so nicely, and she spoke it all so enthusiastically that after the play, Srila Prabhupada got up off his Vyasasana and he walked around to her, and he took his garland off and put his garland on Vishalini, and he folded his hands like that and bent down and did pranams to Vishalini. So he really appreciated what she had done.
I was on Sankirtan actually, in plainclothes, doing plainclothes Sankirtan. I came back and there was this kind of big crowd had assembled, and we used to do Sankirtan. We had a centre downtown. We would come back for lunch and things like that. And a couple of doors up from our place, I noticed there was smoke coming out of this building, flames were coming out, and there were some women, you know, screaming out, "Help, help!" And one of them, I think, was on the ledge or something like that. Apparently the fire had come up the stairwell and blocked their exit. And they were up on a 3rd floor. So myself and I think Yasso, another devotee, we were both out and saying, we came back, we were looking up, and these girls, they were just young girls actually, they were just like 19 or 20, they were screaming, "Help, help us." The fire brigade hadn't arrived. We must have just, we came back just at that time when it was all happening. And the fire brigade hadn't arrived yet. So they were screaming, "It's coming up the stair, it's coming closer," like that. So I was looking at Yasso, he's looking at me, and we ran back to the shop, and I said, and in the shop all the preparations were going on for the Rath Yatra parade. There was all sorts of things all over the floor, and the Manajis were working on the canopy for the Rath cart, putting on the finishing touches, and I think Yasso said, "Quick, give us that canopy." Right, and we got this huge canopy, you know, the Rath Yatra cart canopy that covers the top part of the cart. So we got it, and we took it out in the street, and we spread it out. And we got a bunch of karmis. I guess there was like half a dozen devotees came out, and a whole bunch of karmis were there, and we spread it out all over real tight, and it went out round. Like sometimes you see these firemen, they get these kind of round tarpaulin things, and people jump on them. So we were thinking like that they could jump onto this thing. So we held it out and we stretched it right out, and then we all jump, jump. So the girls, they didn't want to jump, you know. I mean, obviously it was a long way from up there to down there onto this thing. They didn't know what to make of it. Jump, jump, jump. And I remember one girl said, no, I don't want to jump. So I think that girl didn't jump. She went out the back and tried to get across to another building or something like that. But one girl did jump, to my amazement, because I actually thought they wouldn't jump. But anyway, so she did jump. She came flying down, boom. And it was okay. The canopy, Lord Jagannath's canopy, had saved her. The canopy had held. I mean, she didn't drop through the canopy and splatter on the ground or anything. So, you know, all the devotees, Haribol, and all the karmis, you know, they, hey, like this, you know. And then, now I think there was one or two, a couple jumped. And then somehow the press had arrived already by that stage. They were taking photos. The fire brigade arrived just after that, and I think anyone else who was left in the building, they got out. But later that night, it was reported to Prabhupada. And the next day, that story made the front page of practically all the papers here in Melbourne, and actually even in other cities, and it got into the front page of one national paper. And it said, Hare Krishna's saved women from blazing inferno, words to that effect. So Prabhupada was very happy. He was very happy when he actually told the devotees to get all the clips and save the clips. He wanted a copy of those clips, and he wanted to take them with him. And he said, this is very good. This is very good for our reputation. So it was an interesting story that I remember.
And again, also, you know, when we got to Mayapur in 77, that was just before Prabhupada got his real, you know, that really bad sickness which eventually led to his disappearance. We had been down to Bhubaneswar, and then we came up to Calcutta to stay for a month or so. And one man came from Mahesh Pandit's Samadhi, and he was a pujari there, like the Saivite, and he wanted Srila Prabhupada to come and do a program there. We knew it was going to be very small, you know, what we would kind of consider a rinky-dink little affair, you know. We knew it. And, but Prabhupada immediately agreed to the man's request. He had come during the massage and spoke in Bengali. So Prabhupada agreed, and then he went away. But I couldn't speak Bengali, but I knew what was going on. So then I was kind of unhappy because I knew how weak Prabhupada was by that time. And in fact, when we first arrived in Mayapur, one morning on the balcony after breakfast, Prabhupada was looking out over the fields, and then he turned to me and he said, "Never in my life have I felt as weak as I do now." But then he added, he said, "But still I would like to finish this Bhagavatam." And I had seen evidences of Prabhupada's decrease in general health and fitness. Several times I had to literally pick him up when he had collapsed on staircases. So anyway, I was just very concerned. So when this man came, I really didn't want Prabhupada to go. And so I asked him, kind of a little complainingly, I guess, "Srila Prabhupada, why do you have to go?" He said, No, he's asked, I must go. He said, "It's preaching." So I said, "But Prabhupada, there's so many sannyasis here, they can all do the program." He said, "No, he wants me to go, I must go." So, because I was a bit upset by it, then Prabhupada said, just like, that story in the Krishna book about Pradyumna, he was injured on the battlefield, and so when he was taken, then immediately he went back to fight, even though he was injured. So he said that was his duty. So then I said, but Srila Prabhupada, it was his charioteer's duty to take him off the battlefield when he was sick. So then Prabhupada said, yes, and it was his duty to immediately return and fight. So he defeated me, So that, again, it was his determination, and we did do that program. Prabhupada just simply wanted to encourage the man, and we went and we did that program. And I remember that it was, there was like a pandal, a stage, and there was some really rickety steps, about 4 or 5 steps leading up to the stage. So when Prabhupada approached that to go up, he didn't ask for help or anything, and he immediately, started stepping up one by one. And by that time, I was already aware of how weak he was, so I was standing on the step below him. As he went up one step, I went up one step, and I had my hands out like this, just in case anything happened. And Prabhupada was actually pushing himself up the steps with his cane. He had so little strength in his legs, so he put one foot up, and then to get the other one up, he would actually push himself up with his cane. So when he got to the second to top step, he was straining like anything, and then all of a sudden, his strength went, and he just collapsed. But I was right behind him, stood on the lower step, and I just caught him, and I just, had to literally carry him up to the top and put him on the stage. And I put him up there, Prabhupada just, walked over to his seat and sat down like nothing had happened. So, Prabhupada literally sacrificed his life for us. There's no question of it. I saw it. He just wore his body out. If Prabhupada, if there was a cause for Prabhupada's disappearance, like a cause of death, the Kamis are always fond of identifying the cause of death. You could just say that Prabhupada wore his body out in the service of mankind. That was the cause of his death.
Krishna Kirtana Ganana Tanapano Premamritam Banidhi